Some wounds never heal, no matter how far you run into the wilderness to escape them. For 20 years, Amos Wilder had been running from the memory of his son's death, hiding in the Colorado mountains where no one could find him or his guilt. But this February morning, as he checked his trap lines through falling snow, he heard something that stopped his heart cold, the sound of a child crying in the frozen woods. What he found beneath that towering pine tree wasn't human, but it was young and scared and alone, just like his boy had been on that terrible night so long ago. This creature, part child and part beast, looked up at him with eyes that begged for the one thing Amos thought he could never give again, a father's love. What happens when a man gets a second chance to save a child, even if that child isn't quite human? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carved wooden horse sat on the mantel where it had gathered dust for 20 years. Its painted mane faded, and one ear chipped from the day it fell when little Timothy knocked it over in his excitement. Amos Wilder glanced at it every morning when he lit the fire, and every evening when he banked the coals, but he never touched it. Some things were meant to stay frozen in time, like grief, like regret, like the moment when everything good in your life walks out the door and never comes back. The cabin stood solid against the mountain wind. Built by Amos's own hands from pine logs he'd felled and hauled himself. 12 feet by 16 feet of sanctuary, tucked into a natural clearing where the aspens gave way to towering spruce and the morning sun could find its way through the canopy. The roof was steep-pitched to shed snow, and the chinking between the logs was tight enough to keep out everything except the cold that seemed to seep into his bones no matter how hot he kept the fire burning. This morning was no different from 1,000 others that had come before it. Amos rolled from his narrow bunk as the first grey light filtered through the single window, his joints protesting the movement with the particular ache that comes to men who've spent too many winters in the high country. At 53, his body carried the history of every fall from a horse, every night spent sleeping on frozen ground, every cord of wood split, and every mile walked through snow that came up past his knees. He dressed in the same order he'd followed for 2 decades. Wool socks first, then the long underwear that his grandmother had knitted before the war, heavy canvas pants that could turn aside brambles and rock, a flannel shirt soft with age and wear. The ritual was comforting in its sameness, each piece of clothing a familiar weight, each motion practiced until it required no thought at all. The coffee was strong and black, made from beans he traded for with the supply wagon that came up the mountain road twice each summer. He drank it from a tin cup that had been his father's, standing at the window and watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes that promised a storm before the day was through. February in the High Rockies was not a forgiving month, and Amos had learned to read the signs that spelled the difference between inconvenience and disaster. The trap lines called to him as they did every morning, a circuit of steel and cunning that stretched for miles through the forest. Marten and beaver, fox and the occasional wolf, all of them bound by their own hunger and his understanding of their habits. It was honest work for a man who'd grown tired of the dishonesty of civilization, where words meant one thing and actions meant another, where promises were made to be broken and trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. He shouldered his pack and checked his rifle, a Winchester that had belonged to his grandfather and still shot true after half a century of faithful service. The forest was quiet in the way that only comes with falling snow, each flake muffling sound until the world seemed wrapped in cotton wool. His boots left deep prints in the fresh powder as he followed the familiar trail that wound between the trees, reading the signs that told him what had passed this way in the night. The first trap was empty. The second held a red fox, whose pelt would bring a fair price when the supply wagon came again. He reset the trap with the patience of long practice, his hands moving with the certainty that comes from years of repetition. The work was solitary and demanding, requiring a kind of focus that left no room for the thoughts that might otherwise crowd into the spaces between heartbeats. It Was at the fourth trap that he heard it, a sound so unexpected that it stopped him cold in the middle of checking the mechanism for ice. The cry of a child, thin and desperate, cutting through the falling snow like a knife through silk. For a moment he stood perfectly still, wondering if his mind had finally snapped under the weight of too many years alone. Too many conversations with ghosts that never answered back. But the sound came again, closer now, and unmistakably real. Amos felt his heart begin to race with a rhythm he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the particular terror that comes to a parent when they hear their child in distress. The rational part of his mind reminded him that there were no children for 100 miles in any direction, that what he was hearing must be a trick of the wind or the cry of some animal he didn't recognize. He followed the sound anyway, crashing through the underbrush with an urgency that surprised him. The crying grew louder as he pushed deeper into the forest, leading him away from his familiar trails and into a part of the wilderness he seldom visited. The snow was deeper here, untouched by human passage, and the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated the canopy above. When he finally found the source of the crying, Amos stopped so suddenly that he nearly fell face first into the snow. Huddled beneath the spreading branches of an enormous pine tree was something that defied every rational explanation his mind could offer. It was roughly the size of a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, but covered in thick dark fur that was matted with snow and ice. Its face was almost human, but broader and more primitive, with a flat nose and deep-set eyes that gleamed with an intelligence too old for its apparent age. The creature looked up at him with those ancient eyes and continued crying, great heaving sobs that shook its small frame and sent clouds of vapor into the cold air. One of its arms hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, and there were scratches and cuts visible through the matted fur. It had been injured badly and left alone in the wilderness to die. Amos stared at the impossible sight for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, to fit this reality into the neat categories he'd spent a lifetime constructing. Mountain man, wild animal, myth, legend. None of them seemed adequate to describe the creature that sat before him, looking up at him with eyes that held a desperate plea for help. The creature made a sound, not quite words, but something that conveyed meaning nonetheless. It reached toward him with its good arm, its small hand grasping at empty air, and in that gesture Amos saw something that broke his heart all over again. It was the same reaching motion his son had made in those final moments, when fever had taken hold and death had come calling, despite every prayer Amos had whispered into the darkness. Without conscious thought, Amos found himself kneeling in the snow beside the creature. Up close, he could see the details that distance had hidden, the way its breathing came in short, painful gasps, the blood that matted the fur around several deep cuts, the way it shivered despite its thick coat. Whatever this thing was, it was dying, and it was young, and it was alone. "Easy now," Amos said, surprised to hear his own voice after hours of silence. "Easy there, little one." The creature's crying diminished to quiet whimpers as Amos slowly reached out his hand. It flinched at first, then allowed him to touch its shoulder, feeling the solid reality of muscle and bone beneath the fur. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was hurt. And despite every instinct that told him to back away and pretend he'd never seen it, Amos found himself making a decision that would change everything. He shrugged off his pack and pulled out the thick wool blanket he always carried for emergencies. The creature didn't resist as he wrapped it gently around its small frame, though it whimpered when he accidentally jostled the broken arm. The sound cut through him like a blade, awakening feelings he'd thought were buried too deep to ever resurface. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, more to himself than to the creature. "Get you somewhere warm and safe." The journey back to the cabin took twice as long as usual, with Amos carrying his unlikely burden as carefully as he would have carried precious crystal. The creature weighed less than he'd expected, but its body heat soaked through the blanket and into his chest, reminding him of other times when he'd carried a child this way. The snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made, as if the mountain itself was keeping their secret. By the time they reached the cabin, both of them were exhausted. Amos kicked open the door and carried the creature inside, setting it down gently on the bed before rushing to build up the fire. The flames caught quickly, filling the small space with warmth and dancing light that made everything seem less impossible than it had in the forest. He turned back to his unexpected guest and found it watching him with those remarkable eyes. In the firelight, he could see that it was indeed young, a child of whatever species it belonged to, hurt and frightened and completely dependent on his kindness. The broken arm would need setting, the cuts would need cleaning, and the creature would need food and water and time to heal. As Amos began gathering supplies from his medical kit, he caught sight of the wooden horse on the mantel. For the first time in 20 years, he reached up and took it down, holding it in his weathered hands and feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped with such love and hope. He looked from the toy to the creature on his bed, and something deep inside his chest began to thaw. "Looks like we're going to be spending some time together," he said softly. And for the first time in 2 decades, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The storm that had been threatening all morning arrived with the fury of something unleashed. By noon, the wind was howling around the cabin like a living thing, driving snow against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass in its frames. Amos had seen plenty of mountain storms in his 20 years of solitude, but this one carried a weight of menace that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He lit the brass storm lantern that had belonged to his father, its warm yellow glow pushing back the premature darkness that the storm clouds had brought. The light fell across the small form on his bed, illuminating the creature that had turned his orderly world upside down in the space of a few hours. It hadn't spoken, if indeed it could speak, but its eyes followed his every movement with an intelligence that was both comforting and unsettling. Setting the broken arm had been a trial for both of them. The creature had whimpered and thrashed as Amos carefully straightened the bone and wrapped it in splints made from kindling wood and strips torn from an old shirt. But it had seemed to understand that he was trying to help, holding still when he needed it to, gripping his hand with surprising strength when the pain became too much to bear in silence. Now it lay propped against his pillows, wrapped in every spare blanket he owned, watching him prepare a simple meal of venison stew and hardtack. The cuts on its body had been cleaned and bandaged, though Amos had been amazed at how quickly they seemed to be healing. Whatever this creature was, it possessed a constitution far more robust than any human child. The wind picked up again, shaking the entire cabin and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Amos glanced toward the window, where nothing was visible beyond a wall of white. They would be trapped here together for at least the next day, possibly longer if the storm continued with this intensity. The thought should have troubled him. 20 years of solitude had made him uncomfortable with company of any kind, but instead he found himself oddly at peace with them. "Arrangement, quite a blowout there," he said to the creature, more for the comfort of his own voice than because he expected a response. "Good thing I found you when I did. You wouldn't have lasted another hour in this weather." The creature tilted its head at the sound of his voice, a gesture so human-like that it sent a shiver down Amos's spine. It made a soft sound in return, not quite a growl, but not quite speech either, something that seemed to convey both gratitude and curiosity. When Amos brought the bowl of stew closer, the creature sniffed delicately at the contents before taking a tentative sip. The sight of it eating brought back memories so sharp they took his breath away. Timothy at the kitchen table, struggling with a spoon too big for his small hands, more food ending up on his shirt than in his mouth. The way he would look up at his father with those bright eyes, seeking approval for every small accomplishment. The trust that had been absolute and unquestioning until the day Amos failed him "Slow down there," Amos said as the creature began eating more eagerly. "Don't want to make yourself sick." As if it understood his words, the creature slowed its pace, taking smaller spoonfuls and watching Amos's face for guidance. The intelligence in those dark eyes was unmistakable now, and with it came a growing certainty that this was no simple animal. There was something almost human in the way it held itself, in the careful way it used its good hand to manage the spoon, in the gratitude that seemed to radiate from its entire being. The afternoon wore on, in a strange kind of companionship. Amos tended the fire and checked his supplies, while the creature rested, but he found himself constantly glancing over to make sure it was still breathing, still comfortable, still there. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the particular anxiety that comes with being responsible for something fragile and precious. As evening fell and the storm continued to rage outside, Amos settled into his chair beside the fire with a cup of coffee and his worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. It had been his habit for years to read in the evenings, the familiar words, a comfort in the long mountain nights. But tonight he found his attention wandering to the small figure on his bed, to the steady rise and fall of its breathing, to the way the firelight played across its unusual features. "You know," he said, closing the book and leaning forward in his chair, "I never thought I'd have company again. Got used to talking to myself mostly. Been doing it for so long I'm probably half crazy by now." The creature turned its head toward him, those remarkable eyes reflecting the firelight like twin stars. It made another soft sound, almost like a question, and Amos found himself answering as if he'd understood perfectly. "My name's Amos," he said. "Amos Wilder. I've been living up here for 20 years now, ever since—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat like fishhooks. "Well, ever since I had reason to leave the world behind." The creature struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement jarred its broken arm. But its eyes never left Amos's face, and there was something in that steady gaze that invited confidence, that seemed to promise understanding without judgment. "I had a boy once," Amos continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Timothy. He was about your size, maybe a little smaller. Smart as a whip and twice as curious. Always getting into things he shouldn't, always asking questions I couldn't answer." He paused, lost in memories that were both precious and painful. "He got sick one winter. Fever took him fast, faster than I could get help. I couldn't save him." The creature made a sound that was unmistakably sympathetic, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in its chest. It reached out with its good hand, not quite touching Amos, but extending the gesture of comfort anyway. The simple kindness of it nearly undid him. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and somewhere in that wild sound, Amos thought he heard something else, a deeper note, like a horn blown in the distance, or the call of some great animal. The creature heard it too, its head snapping toward the window with sudden alertness. For a moment fear flickered across its features, quickly replaced by something that might have been longing. "Friends of yours out there?" Amos asked, following the creature's gaze toward the storm-darkened window. The creature looked back at him and shook its head with surprising clarity, then pointed to itself and made a gesture that somehow conveyed abandonment, rejection, loss. The meaning was unmistakable. Whatever was out there in the storm, it had cast this young one out, left it to die alone in the wilderness. Amos felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same rage he'd felt when the doctor had told him there was nothing more to be done, when the preacher had spoken about God's plan and mysterious ways. What kind of family abandoned their young? What kind of world allowed children to suffer for the failures of their elders? "Well," he said firmly, "you're safe now. Whatever happened before, whoever hurt you, they'll have to go through me to get to you." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to comfort the creature. He hadn't made a promise to protect anyone in 20 years, hadn't felt the fierce protectiveness that came with caring for something vulnerable and dependent. But looking at this strange, wonderful being that had wandered into his life like an answer to a prayer he'd never dared to speak, Amos felt something long frozen, beginning to thaw in his chest. The creature seemed to understand the weight of his words. It settled back against the pillows with a soft sigh, its eyes drifting closed as exhaustion finally claimed it. But even in sleep, one small hand remained outstretched toward Amos, as if seeking the reassurance of his presence. As the storm continued to rage outside and the fire burned low in the grate, Amos remained in his chair, watching over the sleeping creature and feeling the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. 20 years of solitude were ending, whether he was ready or not. The brass storm lantern flickered but held steady, its light a beacon of hope in the darkness that had seemed absolute for so very long. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow and air so clear it seemed to ring like a bell when Amos stepped outside the next morning. The creature, he couldn't keep thinking of it as the creature forever, had slept through the night without stirring, its breathing deep and even, the healing sleep of the young and resilient. On the mantel, his mother's old Bible sat where it had for 20 years, its leather binding cracked with age and its pages yellowed by time. Pressed between the pages of Psalms were the wildflowers Timothy had picked for his mother's grave, the last spring of his life, Indian paintbrush and columbines that had long since faded to brown whispers of their former glory. Amos had opened that book exactly twice in the past 2 decades, both times on the anniversary of his son's death, searching for words of comfort that never seemed to come. This morning, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he found himself taking it down and settling into his chair beside the bed. The creature stirred at the movement, those remarkable eyes opening to focus on him with an alertness that seemed impossible after such trauma. "Good morning," Amos said softly. "How are you feeling?" The creature struggled to sit up, favoring its broken arm, but moving with considerably more ease than the day before. It looked at the Bible in Amos's hands and tilted its head with curiosity, making a soft questioning sound. "This was my mother's," Amos explained, running his fingers over the worn cover. "She used to read to me from it when I was about your size. Stories about people who lost their way and found it again, about forgiveness and second chances." He paused, meeting the creature's steady gaze. "I haven't been much for reading it lately, but I thought you might like to hear a story." To his amazement, the creature nodded with clear understanding. It settled back against the pillows and watched expectantly as Amos opened the book to a passage he remembered from his childhood. The story of the Good Shepherd, who left 99 sheep to search for the one that was lost. As he read, Amos became aware that the creature was listening with an intensity that went beyond mere attention. It seemed to understand not just the rhythm of his voice, but the meaning behind the words, responding to the emotional peaks and valleys of the narrative with subtle changes in expression. When he reached the part about the shepherd carrying the lost sheep home, the creature made a sound that was unmistakably pleased. "You understand, don't you?" Amos said, closing the book. "More than I gave you credit for." The creature pointed to itself, then to Amos, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the cabin around them. The meaning was clear. It understood that it had been lost and found, that this place had become its refuge. Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself. Amos would wake first, build up the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast that they would share in companionable silence. The creature's appetite was enormous, requiring portions that would have satisfied a grown man. But it ate with careful manners that spoke of some kind of upbringing, some previous experience with civilized behavior. Communication developed gradually, built on gestures and sounds, and the kind of intuitive understanding that grows between beings who share a common need. The creature learned to point when it needed something, to shake its head when offered something it didn't want, to nod when it understood. More remarkably, it began to attempt simple words, its voice a rough approximation of human speech that nevertheless conveyed clear meaning. "Amos," it said one morning, pointing to him with its good hand, the sound of his name in that strange, Wonderful voice hit Amos like a physical blow. "That's right," he managed to say through the tightness in his throat. "Amos, I'm Amos." The creature beamed at his approval, an expression of pure joy that transformed its features and made it look even more human than before. It pointed to itself and made a sound that might have been a name, though nothing Amos could properly pronounce. After several attempts, they settled on Little Bear, which seemed to please them both. "Little Bear," Amos repeated, and the creature, Little Bear, clapped its hands together with delight. The broken arm was healing with remarkable speed, already showing signs of knitting that would have taken weeks in a human child. But it was the emotional healing that amazed Amos most. Day by day, he watched the fear fade from Little Bear's eyes, replaced by curiosity and trust, and something that looked very much like affection. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the fire was banked for the night, Amos found himself telling stories. Stories about Timothy, about the life he'd lived before the mountain, about the things he'd seen and learned in his 53 years of walking the earth. Little Bear listened to everything with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions in its mixture of sounds and gestures, always seeming to understand far more than it could express. "I used to build things with Timothy," Amos said one night, whittling a simple whistle from a piece of pine. "Little toys mostly. Horses and wagons and soldiers. He had such imagination. He could make up stories about anything I carved, whole adventures that would go on for hours." Little Bear watched the knife work its way through the wood, its eyes bright with interest. When Amos finished the whistle and demonstrated its clear, sweet tone, Little Bear reached for it with obvious desire. "Careful now," Amos said, placing the instrument in the small, careful hands. "It's sharp on the edges." Little Bear examined the whistle with the thoroughness of a scholar, running its fingers over the smooth wood and the carefully carved holes. When it finally brought it to its lips and produced a pure, clear note, Amos felt his heart skip a beat. The sound was perfect, controlled, musical in a way that suggested natural talent. "Timothy loved music," Amos said quietly. "His mother used to sing to him every night before bed. Lullabies and hymns and old folk songs her grandmother had taught her. He had the sweetest voice, could have been a choir boy if we'd stayed in town." Little Bear lowered the whistle and looked at him with those wise, ancient eyes. It pointed to Amos, then made a gesture that clearly asked him to sing. "Oh, I'm no singer," Amos protested. "Haven't carried a tune in 20 years. But Little Bear was insistent, making the gesture again, and adding what sounded like please in its rough approximation of speech. And somehow sitting there in the firelight with this impossible being who had wandered into his life like a miracle, Amos found himself humming an old lullaby he'd thought he'd forgotten. Little Bear joined in on the whistle, finding the melody by ear and harmonizing with a skill that took Amos's breath away. Together, they filled the cabin with music for the first time in 2 decades, and for those few minutes, the weight of grief that Amos had carried for so long seemed to lift from his shoulders. When the song ended, Little Bear reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently with its small fingers. In that touch, Amos felt something he'd thought was lost forever. The particular joy that comes from sharing wonder with a child, the deep satisfaction of protecting and nurturing something innocent and precious. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in that sound, Amos thought he heard the echo of other voices, other calls. But for now, in this moment, the cabin was warm and bright and filled with the kind of love he'd almost forgotten was possible. The tracks appeared on the 4th morning after the storm, pressed deep into the snow that surrounded the cabin like signatures written in an ancient script. Amos discovered them when he stepped outside to split kindling, and the sight stopped him cold in the grey pre-dawn light. They were enormous, easily twice the size of his own boot prints and shaped like human feet, but broader, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from each toe. He knelt beside the clearest print, his hunting knife laid across it for scale. The blade barely spanned the width of the heel. Whatever had made these tracks was massive, far larger than any bear or mountain cat he'd encountered in 20 years of wilderness living. But more disturbing than their size was their placement. They formed a rough circle around the cabin, as if something had been pacing the perimeter, studying the structure, perhaps testing for weaknesses. Inside, Little Bear was awake and watching the door with obvious anxiety. The moment Amos entered, it began making urgent sounds, pointing toward the window and then to itself. Its meaning was unmistakable. It knew what had been circling in the night, and it was afraid. "Easy there," Amos said, though he felt far from easy himself. "Whatever it was, it's gone now." But Little Bear shook its head emphatically, pointing again toward the forest. It struggled out of bed, despite Amos's protests, moving to the window on unsteady legs and peering out through the frost-covered glass. What it saw there made it shrink back with a whimper of fear. Amos joined it at the window, following its gaze toward the tree line 50 yards away. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar landscape of pine and aspen, clothed in winter white. Then movement caught his eye, a shadow shifting between the trees, too large and too purposeful to be anything natural. As he watched, the shadow resolved itself into a figure that made his blood run cold. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the morning light. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms long enough that its hands nearly reached its knees. But it was the face that sent ice through Amos's veins, unmistakably similar to Little Bear's features, but larger, older, and filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. The creature, for there was no other word that fit, stared directly at the cabin window. Even at this distance, Amos could feel the weight of its gaze, the calculating study of a predator assessing potential prey. It raised one massive hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then melted back into the forest with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. "Family?" Amos asked, though he already knew the answer from Little Bear's terrified reaction. Little Bear nodded miserably, then made a series of gestures that told a story Amos was beginning to understand. Rejection, abandonment, a child cast out from its tribe for some transgression that meant nothing to human sensibilities, but apparently everything to its own kind. Amos felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, the same helpless rage he'd experienced when the world had taken Timothy from him. What kind of beings abandoned their young to die in the wilderness? What crime could a child commit that warranted such cruel punishment? He moved to the gun rack and took down the Winchester, checking the action and counting the cartridges in the magazine. 15 shots, and he was a good marksman when it mattered. But against something that size, with reflexes honed by millennia of survival in the deep woods, would it be enough? Little Bear saw him preparing the rifle and made a sound of distress, reaching out with its good hand as if to stop him. When Amos looked at it questioningly, it shook its head and made a gesture that clearly meant no killing. The mercy in that simple motion, a child protecting the family, that had rejected it, nearly broke Amos's heart. "I won't hurt them, unless they try to hurt you," he promised, though he kept the rifle close at hand. "But I need to be ready just in case." The day passed in tense watchfulness. Every sound from the forest sent Little Bear scurrying to the window. Every shifting shadow outside made Amos reach for his weapon. But the big creature didn't show itself again, though Amos caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Shadows that might have been trees swaying in the wind, or might have been something else entirely. It was Little Bear who finally explained the situation. Using a combination of gestures, sounds, and crude drawings scratched in the dirt beside the fireplace. The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its simplicity, a young one born different from the rest, marked by some trait that made it unacceptable to the rigid social structure of its people. Cast out to live or die by its own strength, with no hope of ever returning to the family that had birthed it. "They're watching," Amos said, understanding at last. "Making sure you don't try to come back." Little Bear nodded sadly, then pointed to him and made a protective gesture, as if to say that its presence was putting him in danger. The selflessness of it, a child more concerned for his safety than its own, reminded Amos so powerfully of Timothy that he had to turn away to hide the tears that suddenly burned his eyes. That evening, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped below zero, Amos made a decision that would change everything. He took his father's hunting knife from its place on the mantel, the blade that had been passed down through 3 generations of Wilder men, the steel that had carved their way through wilderness and hardship, and the 1,000 small challenges that defined a life lived close to the bone. "This belonged to my father," he told Little Bear, holding the knife so the firelight played along its edge. "And his father before him. It's never failed a Wilder man when he needed it most." Little Bear examined the weapon with the respect it deserved, running careful fingers along the worn handle and testing the sharpness of the blade against a piece of kindling. When it looked up at Amos with questioning eyes, he felt the last of his emotional walls crumble. "Because you're family now," he said simply. "And I protect my family, no matter what comes calling in the night." Outside, something howled in the distance, a sound like wind through a canyon, like grief given voice, like the loneliness of creatures that had walked the earth since before humans learned to make fire. But inside the cabin, warmed by the glow of the hearth and the unexpected joy of connection, 2 unlikely souls prepared to face whatever darkness might come. The hunting knife gleamed in the firelight, a promise of protection that spanned generations, a legacy of love that refused to be broken by time or circumstance or the judgment of beings who had forgotten what it meant to show mercy to the lost and afraid. The pocket watch had stopped ticking the day Timothy died, its hands frozen at 3:47 in the afternoon, the exact moment when Amos's world had shattered beyond repair. For 20 years it had sat on the small shelf beside his bed, a monument to time suspended, to a grief so profound it had literally stopped the flow of moments. This morning, as he sat watching Little Bear sleep in the pale dawn light, Amos picked up the watch and wound it for the first time in 2 decades. The mechanism caught with a soft click, and suddenly the steady tick-tick-tick filled the cabin like a heartbeat restored to life. Little Bear's eyes opened at the sound, focusing immediately on the watch in Amos's hands with an expression of wonder. "It belonged to my father," Amos said quietly. "And his father before him. Came over from the old country in 1847, made it through the wagon trains and the Indian Wars and everything else this land could throw at it. Until Timothy—" He stopped, the familiar tightness gripping his throat. Little Bear sat up carefully, its broken arm now almost completely healed, and held out its hand for the watch. Amos hesitated for a moment, then placed the precious timepiece in those small, careful fingers. Little Bear examined it with the thoroughness that had become familiar, running its fingertips over the worn gold case and holding it up to its ear to listen to the steady rhythm within. When it handed the watch back, Little Bear made a series of gestures that Amos had learned to interpret with increasing accuracy. Time moving forward, pain healing, the past and future connected by the precious gift of the present moment. "You're wiser than I gave you credit for," Amos said, slipping the watch into his vest pocket where it belonged. "Wiser than I've been anyway." The days that followed brought revelations that challenged everything Amos thought he knew about the natural world. Little Bear began showing him things, subtle signs in the forest that spoke of an intelligence far older than human civilization, patterns in the way certain trees grew, arrangements of stones that looked random but followed a logic too complex for casual observation, markings on bark that resembled a primitive form of writing. "Your people have been here a long time," Amos said as they stood before a massive pine whose trunk bore symbols carved so deep they had become part of the tree's living wood. "Longer than mine, I'd guess," Little Bear nodded solemnly. Then began a complex series of gestures that told the story of its people, beings who had walked these mountains since the ice retreated, who understood the secret languages of stone and stream and wind. They were the guardians, the watchers, the keepers of ancient knowledge that most humans had forgotten in their rush toward progress and civilization. But with that knowledge came rules, traditions as rigid as iron and twice as unforgiving. Little Bear's crime, as near as Amos could understand it, had been simple compassion, the rescue of a human child from a flooding river, an action that had broken the sacred law of non-interference. For that mercy it had been marked as tainted, forever separated from its own kind. They punished you for saving someone. Amos felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. For doing what any decent being would do. Little Bear's response was a gesture of resignation, of acceptance of a fate it couldn't change. But in its eyes, Amos saw something that reminded him powerfully of his own reflection in the years after Timothy's death. The hollow look of someone who had lost everything that gave life meaning. That night, as they sat by the fire, sharing a dinner of roasted rabbit and wild onions, Amos found himself talking about things he'd never shared with another living soul. The weight of responsibility that came with being a father. The terror of knowing that someone so precious depended entirely on your strength and wisdom and ability to keep them safe. The crushing guilt when that protection failed. I was supposed to watch him, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha had taken sick with the fever, and I was sitting up with both of them, trying to keep the temperature down, with cool cloths and prayers that didn't seem to reach high enough. Timothy was getting better, I was sure of it, so I stepped outside for just a minute to get some fresh air. Little Bear listened with the stillness of deep water, its eyes reflecting the firelight like pools of ancient wisdom. When I came back, he was burning up again. The fever had spiked while I was gone, and by the time I got him to the doctor, Amos stopped, unable to voice the words that had haunted him for 20 years. If I hadn't left him alone, if I'd stayed where I belonged, he might still be alive. Little Bear rose from its place by the fire and came to stand beside Amos's chair. With infinite gentleness, it placed its small hand on his shoulder and made a sound that conveyed more comfort than any words could have managed. In that touch, Amos felt something he'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of forgiveness. Not from God or from the world, but from himself. The sound came again that night, drifting through the darkness, like the voice of the mountain itself. But this time, Little Bear didn't cower at the window. Instead, it stood at the door and made a sound in return. Not a call for help, but something that might have been explanation, or perhaps defiance. The answer that came back carried notes of loss and longing that transcended the boundaries between species. "They miss you," Amos said, understanding flooding through him. "Despite everything, they miss you." Little Bear nodded sadly, then pointed to itself and then to him, making the gesture that had come to mean family, belonging, home. The message was clear. It had found a new family now, a place where compassion wasn't a crime, and love wasn't conditional on conformity to ancient laws. As Amos wound the pocket watch before bed, listening to its steady rhythm mark the passage of moments that were no longer frozen in grief, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Time was moving forward again, carrying him away from the past that had trapped him and toward a future he was only beginning to imagine. Outside, the night was filled with sounds that might have been wind or might have been voices, calling across the vast darkness between understanding and fear, between isolation and connection, between the rigid demands of tradition and the simple mercy of an open heart. The watch ticked steadily in his hand, marking time that was precious because it was shared, counting moments that mattered because they were filled with the particular grace that comes when two lost souls find their way home to each other. The medicine pouch had belonged to Amos's grandfather, old Pete Wilder, who had learned the healing arts from a Ute medicine man during the early days of territorial settlement. The worn leather bag contained herbs and roots gathered from a dozen different mountain ecosystems: willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, wild mint for stomach ailments, and a dozen other remedies that had served the Wilder family for 3 generations. Amos had carried it with him for 20 years, but never opened it. The knowledge inside, too, bound up with memories of helplessness and failure. This morning, as Little Bear complained of aches in its rapidly healing arm, Amos found himself reaching for the pouch with hands that remembered skills his mind had tried to forget. The leather was supple despite its age, and the herbs inside still held their potency, their earthy scents rising like incense when he opened the drawstring closure. "Let me see that arm," he said, and Little Bear obediently extended its limb for examination. The bone had healed remarkably fast, faster than should have been possible, but Amos could see signs of inflammation around the break site. "My grandfather taught me a thing or two about fixing what hurts. He prepared a poultice of comfrey and willow bark, grinding the dried herbs between 2 stones until they formed a paste that he spread on a clean cloth." Little Bear watched the process with fascination, occasionally pointing to different herbs and making questioning sounds. When Amos named each ingredient and explained its purpose, Little Bear nodded with the kind of recognition that suggested its own people possessed similar knowledge. "Your folks know about healing too, don't they?" Amos asked as he wrapped the poultice around the injured arm. Little Bear's response was a complex series of gestures that painted a picture of ancient wisdom passed down through countless generations. Healing that went beyond herbs and potions to encompass the deep connections between all living things. Knowledge that humans had once shared but had largely forgotten in their rush toward what they called civilization. As the days passed, Little Bear began teaching Amos things that weren't written in any book. How to read the subtle signs that indicated which plants would be strongest for healing. How to listen to the forest itself and understand its moods and needs. How to move through the wilderness with the kind of awareness that made you part of the landscape rather than an intruder within it. "You're showing me secrets," Amos said one afternoon as they sat beside a hidden spring that bubbled up from deep in the earth. "Things your people probably don't share with outsiders." Little Bear made a gesture that encompassed both of them, then pointed to the spring and the forest around them. The meaning was clear. They were no longer outsider and guardian, but partners in something deeper than tribal law or species boundaries. They were family, and family shared everything that mattered. The revelation brought with it a weight of responsibility that Amos felt settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. If Little Bear was sharing sacred knowledge with him, what did that make him? What obligations came with such trust? And what would happen if Little Bear's people discovered the extent of what was being revealed? That night, the calls from the forest came closer than ever before. Not one voice now, but several, creating a harmony that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the mountain. Little Bear listened with an expression that mixed longing with determination, occasionally calling back in its own voice, carrying on what sounded almost like a conversation across the darkness. "What are you telling them?" Amos asked. Little Bear's response was a series of gestures that conveyed defiance, loyalty, and something that might have been a formal declaration. It was choosing its new family over its old one, publicly and irrevocably. The answer that came back from the forest carried notes of anger and grief that needed no translation. Little Bear had made its choice, and that choice was being rejected with a finality that echoed through the mountain night like a death sentence. "I'm sorry," Amos said, understanding the magnitude of what Little Bear had just sacrificed for him. "I never wanted you to have to choose." But Little Bear shook its head and took his hand, squeezing with a strength that seemed to flow from some deep well of certainty. It pointed to him, then to itself, then made the gesture that meant family, home, belonging. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a sacrifice, but a choice made freely and without regret. As the week progressed, Amos began to notice changes in the forest around the cabin. Trees that had been damaged by storms were healing with unusual speed. Game trails that had been abandoned were suddenly busy with life again. Even the weather seemed more settled, as if some fundamental balance was being restored. "You're doing that, aren't you?" he asked Little Bear as they watched a family of deer graze peacefully in the meadow below the cabin. Somehow, you're healing the whole mountain. Little Bear's response was characteristically modest, a gesture that suggested it was simply doing what came naturally, fulfilling a purpose that was as much a part of its being as breathing or eating. But Amos could see the truth in the way the very air around Little Bear seemed charged with vitality, in the way plants grew stronger in its presence, in the way injured animals seemed drawn to seek its touch. The medicine pouch grew lighter each day as Amos found himself using its contents not just for Little Bear's healing, but for the steady stream of forest creatures that began appearing at the cabin's doorstep. A hawk with a broken wing, a fox kit separated from its mother, a young elk caught in an abandoned snare. Little Bear seemed to call them somehow, and Amos found himself serving as assistant to a healing power far beyond anything his grandfather had ever imagined. We're becoming something new, he realized one evening, as they worked together to set the broken leg of a mountain sheep. Neither fully human nor fully whatever you are. Something in between. Little Bear looked up from its careful ministrations and smiled, an expression so purely joyful it took Amos's breath away. In that smile, he saw the future taking shape, not the isolated existence he'd planned to live until death claimed him, but a life of purpose and connection, of service to something larger than his own grief. The medicine pouch rested light in his hands, its ancient wisdom flowing through him to heal wounds he'd never imagined he could touch. And for the first time in 20 years, Amos Wilder felt truly alive. The ancient stone cairn stood deep in a part of the forest Amos had never explored, hidden in a grove of aspens, so old their trunks had grown together into a living cathedral. Little Bear led him there on a crisp morning in late February, moving with the purposeful stride of someone returning to a place of deep significance. The stones were arranged in a perfect spiral, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. How old is this? Amos asked, running his fingers over markings that looked older than anything he'd ever seen. Little Bear's response was a gesture that conveyed vastness, time beyond human comprehension, reaching back to the earliest days when the mountain was young and the world was different. But then it did something that stopped Amos cold. It pointed to the center of the cairn, then to him, then made the unmistakable gesture that meant, "Your son. What are you trying to tell me?" Amos felt his heart begin to race with a mixture of hope and dread. Little Bear knelt beside the cairn and began moving stones with careful precision, revealing a hollow space beneath that contained objects Amos recognized with a shock that nearly drove him to his knees. A child's wooden toy horse painted blue and red, a small pair of boots worn at the toes from countless adventures, a tattered picture book about a boy who befriended the animals of the forest, Timothy's things, possessions that had been buried with his son 20 years ago. "This isn't possible," Amos whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for the wooden horse. It was exactly as he remembered it, down to the chip in the ear and the faded paint on the saddle. "These were buried with him. I put them in the coffin myself." Little Bear's expression was infinitely gentle as it began a complex series of gestures, telling a story that unraveled everything Amos thought he knew about his son's death. The fever that had taken Timothy hadn't been a simple illness, but something far more significant, a calling, a transformation, a passage between worlds that few humans ever experienced. The mountain itself was sacred, Little Bear explained, a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Timothy hadn't died here. He had been chosen, selected by forces older than memory, to serve as a bridge between the world of humans and the ancient realm of the forest guardians. "You're saying Timothy is what? Still alive somewhere?" Amos felt the familiar anger rising, the rage that came when people tried to offer comfort with impossible promises. But Little Bear shook its head sadly. Timothy was gone. In the way that Amos understood, his physical form returned to the earth as all mortal things must. But his spirit, his essence, his pure heart that had never known hatred or prejudice, that had been preserved, transformed, Given new purpose in the eternal cycle that governed all living things, Little Bear pointed to itself, then to the cairn, then to Amos with gestures that gradually painted a picture so impossible and yet so perfect that it left him speechless. Timothy's spirit lived on in the mountain itself, in the ancient network of consciousness that connected every tree and stone and stream. And Little Bear, cast out by its own people, found dying in the snow, was more than just a refugee seeking shelter. It was Timothy's gift to his father, a chance for redemption, for healing, for the kind of love that transcends the boundaries between species and worlds. The night Timothy died, Amos said slowly, his mind struggling to process the implications. I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed for anything. I begged God to give me another chance, to let me be the father I should have been. Little Bear nodded solemnly, then placed its small hand over Amos's heart. The touch was warm, filled with a love so pure it brought tears to his eyes. In that moment, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever, Timothy's presence, not as memory or wishful thinking, but as a living reality that surrounded him like sunlight. The wooden horse in his hands began to change as he watched, its painted surface shimmering with an inner light that revealed new details carved into the wood, symbols that matched those on the stones of the cairn, a message of love that had waited 20 years to be delivered. He's been watching over me, Amos realized, his voice thick with emotion. All these years, through all the loneliness and guilt, he's been here. Little Bear's gestures confirmed what his heart was already beginning to understand. Timothy's spirit had guided him to this mountain, to this cabin, to this isolated existence that had seemed like exile, but was actually preparation. Every skill Amos had learned in his years of solitude, every moment of growth and healing, had been building toward this encounter, this chance to be the father he'd always wanted to be. But the revelation came with a price. And Little Bear's next series of gestures painted a picture that filled Amos with dread. The sacred nature of this land was under threat. The ancient covenants that had protected it for millennia were weakening as the modern world pressed closer to the mountain's heart. Soon, choices would have to be made. Choices that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of the entire network of consciousness that connected all living things in this place. What kind of choices? Amos asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Little Bear's response was complex, involving concepts that stretched the limits of human understanding. The guardians, Little Bear's people, had watched over this sacred ground for countless generations, but their numbers were dwindling and their ancient powers were fading. A new guardian was needed, someone who could bridge the gap between the human world and the older, deeper reality that most people had forgotten, someone who understood both love and loss, who had been tested by grief and emerged with the capacity for infinite compassion, someone who could be trusted with secrets that could reshape the world if they fell into the wrong hands. You're talking about me, Amos said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. You want me to become some kind of guardian? Little Bear nodded, then made a gesture that encompassed the entire forest around them. The position would mean leaving behind any chance of returning to human civilization, of reconnecting with the world he'd abandoned 20 years ago. But it would also mean protecting something precious beyond measure, ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where wonder still existed, where the ancient connections between all living things remained unbroken. The wooden horse seemed to pulse with warmth in his hands, and for a moment Amos could swear he heard Timothy's voice carried on the mountain wind, not words, but a feeling of approval, of love, of a son's pride in his father's capacity for growth and sacrifice. And if I say no? Amos asked. Little Bear's expression grew infinitely sad as it gestured toward the darkening sky above them. Without a guardian, the sacred boundaries would continue to weaken until they failed entirely. The network of consciousness that had protected this place for millennia would collapse, leaving the mountain vulnerable to forces that would strip it of everything that made it special. More than that, Little Bear itself would fade away, its connection to the ancient powers severed by the loss of the sacred ground. It would die, truly and finally, and Timothy's gift to his father would be lost forever. As they sat in the shadow of the ancient cairn, surrounded by evidence of connections that transcended death itself, Amos felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. The choice before him was simple in its complexity: cling to his grief and lose everything that mattered, or embrace a future so strange and wonderful that it challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of reality. The wooden horse gleamed in the fading light, a bridge between worlds, a promise of love that had endured even death to reach across 20 years of darkness and offer the gift of redemption. The eagle feather arrived 3 days after the revelation at the cairn, delivered by a golden eagle that landed on the cabin's porch with the regal bearing of an ancient messenger. The bird waited patiently while Little Bear approached, extending one magnificent wing to reveal the single feather nestled against its body. When Little Bear took the offering with reverent hands, the eagle fixed Amos with eyes that seemed older than the mountains themselves before launching itself back into the sky with powerful wing beats that stirred the air like a benediction. "It's beginning, isn't it?" Amos said, though he already knew the answer from the solemnity in Little Bear's demeanor. Little Bear nodded, then began a series of gestures that explained what the feather represented. It was a summons, a sign that the Guardians had accepted the possibility of Amos becoming one of their number. But acceptance was not automatic. It would have to be earned through trials that would test every aspect of his character, his wisdom, and his commitment to the sacred trust being offered. The feather itself was beautiful beyond description, its surface shimmering with colors that seemed to shift from gold to bronze to deep amber, depending on how the light struck it. When Amos held it up to examine it more closely, he could swear he felt a subtle vibration running through the shaft, as if it were somehow alive, somehow connected to forces he couldn't begin to understand. "Timothy gave you this message, didn't he?" Amos asked, and Little Bear's gentle smile confirmed what his heart already knew. Over the next 2 days, they prepared for what was to come with the methodical care of soldiers readying for battle. Amos cleaned and oiled his grandfather's rifle, though he suspected it would be useless in whatever trials awaited him. He packed his essential supplies: dried meat, hardtack, the medicine pouch, and a few tools that had served him well over the years. But most importantly, he prepared his mind and spirit for challenges he couldn't predict or fully understand. Little Bear seemed to grow more solemn as the appointed time approached, spending long hours in what appeared to be meditation or prayer. Its hands folded around the eagle feather while it swayed gently back and forth. Sometimes Amos caught fragments of sound from these sessions, not words in any language he recognized, but something that felt like music, like the voice of the mountain itself, given expression through Little Bear's throat. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, sharing what might be their last quiet meal together for some time, Little Bear began telling Amos stories about the Guardians who had come before him. Through gestures and sounds, and the crude drawings that had become their shared language, a picture emerged of men and women who had served as bridges between worlds, protectors of ancient knowledge, keepers of the delicate balance that allowed both civilization and wilderness to coexist. Some had been Native Americans who understood the old ways from birth. Others had been settlers like himself, people who had found their way to the mountain through tragedy or calling and discovered a purpose larger than anything they had previously imagined. All of them had been tested, and not all had survived the trials that awaited them. "What happens if I fail?" Amos asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Little Bear's response was honest in its bleakness. Failure would mean not just his own death, but the collapse of the protective barriers that had shielded this sacred ground for generations. The network of consciousness that connected every living thing in the mountain ecosystem would fragment and fade, leaving the land vulnerable to exploitation and destruction. More personally, it would mean that Timothy's sacrifice, his transformation from mortal boy to eternal guardian spirit, would have been in vain. The weight of that responsibility settled on Amos's shoulders like a physical burden. He thought of all the creatures they had healed together, all the signs of renewal and growth he had witnessed since Little Bear came into his life. To lose all of that, to watch it crumble because he wasn't strong enough, or wise enough, or worthy enough, the thought was almost unbearable. But alongside the fear came something else, something he hadn't felt in 20 years. The kind of purpose that made a man willing to risk everything for something greater than himself. The particular courage that comes when you finally understand what you were meant to do with your life. No matter how late that understanding arrives, as dawn broke on the third day, they came. Not just the one massive figure Amos had glimpsed through the trees, but a full council of the Ancient Ones. 7 guardians in total, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall, their powerful forms moving through the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for being so large. They arranged themselves in a circle around the cabin, not threatening but unmistakably official. Their presence transforming the familiar clearing into something that felt like a courtroom or a sacred grove. Little Bear stepped outside to meet them, and Amos was amazed to see how small and vulnerable it looked beside its own kind. But there was no submission in its posture, no indication that it regretted the choices that had led to this moment. If anything, it stood taller as it began what was clearly a formal address, its voice carrying notes of defiance and determination that needed no translation. The response from the council was equally formal, equally measured, but Amos caught undertones of something that might have been respect. Whatever Little Bear was saying, it was being heard with the gravity it deserved. When the exchange was finished, the largest of the guardians, clearly the leader, turned its attention to Amos. The being's eyes were the color of old amber, and looking into them was like staring into the accumulated wisdom of centuries. When it spoke, its voice was like distant thunder, each word carefully chosen and precisely articulated. "Amos Wilder," it said, and hearing his name in that ancient voice sent shivers down his spine. "You have been chosen to undergo the trials of guardianship. Do you accept this calling freely, understanding that success will transform you forever, and failure will mean the end of all you seek to protect?" The moment stretched between them like a held breath. In the silence, Amos could hear the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant cry of a hawk, the steady beating of his own heart. He thought of Timothy, of the wooden horse that had brought them together across the divide between life and death. He thought of Little Bear, who had sacrificed everything for the chance to love and be loved in return. He thought of all the creatures they had healed, all the signs of growth and renewal that had marked their time together. "I accept," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. The leader nodded solemnly, then gestured to the other guardians. They began to move, forming a procession that would lead deeper into the mountain than Amos had ever traveled, to places where the ancient magic was strongest, and the trials could unfold with the full weight of sacred tradition behind them. Little Bear fell into step beside him as they began the journey, pressing the eagle feather into his hand with a squeeze that conveyed more encouragement than any words could have managed. The feather seemed to pulse with warmth against his palm, a tangible reminder that he was not alone in this, that forces beyond his understanding were working to help him succeed. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, Amos felt the familiar world falling away behind him. Each step took him further from the man he had been, the grieving father, the isolated hermit, the broken soul who had fled civilization to nurse his wounds in solitude. Ahead lay trials he couldn't imagine, and a future that would either elevate him to something beyond human understanding or destroy him in the attempt. The eagle feather blazed with inner light in his hand, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. A promise that love could transcend any barrier if the heart was willing to be transformed by its power. And for the first time in 20 years, Amos Wilder walked forward into uncertainty with hope instead of fear lighting his way. The sacred fire burned without consuming, its flames dancing in shades of blue and silver that cast no smoke into the crystal-clear mountain air. Amos had never seen anything like it. Fire that gave warmth and light but left the logs beneath it untouched, as if the flames drew their fuel from some source beyond the physical world. The sight should have filled him with wonder, but as he stood before the circle of ancient guardians, all he could feel was the weight of destiny pressing down on his shoulders like a stone. The ceremonial grove lay hidden in the heart of the mountain, a natural amphitheater carved from living rock and surrounded by trees so old they seemed to bridge the gap between earth and sky. Symbols were carved into every surface, the same markings he had seen on the cairn, but here they seemed to pulse with their own inner light, responding to the presence of the sacred fire like instruments in some cosmic orchestra. "The first trial is courage," the leader of the Guardians announced, his voice resonating through the grove with the authority of ages. "You must face the thing you fear most, without weapon or protection, and emerge with your spirit intact." As he spoke, the flames of the sacred fire began to shift and swirl, forming shapes that made Amos's blood run cold. Images from his past rose from the dancing light, the fever-bright eyes of his dying son, the moment when he realized his brief absence had cost Timothy his life, the crushing weight of guilt that had driven him into 20 years of exile. But these weren't just memories. As the flames took shape, Timothy stepped out of the fire itself, looking exactly as he had in those final moments, pale and burning with fever, his small hand reaching out in desperate need. The sight drove Amos to his knees, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. "Papa," Timothy said, his voice carrying all the pain and confusion of a child who didn't understand why his father couldn't make the hurt stop. "Why did you leave me alone? Why couldn't you save me?" The words hit Amos like physical blows, each one driving deeper into the wound he had carried for 2 decades. This was his greatest fear made manifest, facing the son he had failed, hearing the accusations he had whispered to himself in the darkest hours of the night. Every instinct screamed at him to look away, to flee, to let the guilt consume him, as it had threatened to do for 20 years. Instead, he forced himself to meet Timothy's eyes. "Because I was human," he said, his voice breaking but steady. "Because I was flawed and frightened and I made mistakes. Because I loved you so much that the thought of losing you made me panic, and panic made me weak when you needed me to be strong." Timothy's image flickered, the flames that composed him wavering like heat mirage. "But you did lose me. I died because you weren't there." "Yes," Amos said, tears streaming down his face. "You died. And I've carried that guilt every day since, letting it poison everything good in my life, using it as an excuse to stop living, stop loving, stop trying to be the man you needed me to be." The fire Timothy stepped closer, and Amos could feel the heat radiating from the apparition's form. "So you admit it. You failed me." "I failed you in that moment," Amos agreed, rising to his feet despite the trembling in his legs. "But I won't fail you again. I won't let your death be the end of love in this world. I won't let my guilt destroy the gift you've given me through Little Bear." Something shifted in Timothy's expression, the pain giving way to something that might have been pride. "You understand, then, why I had to leave? Why I had to become something more than just your son?" "You became love itself," Amos said, understanding flooding through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You became the bridge between what was lost and what could still be saved. You gave up your mortal life so that other children, Little Bear, all the creatures we've healed together, could have the father I should have been to you." The image of Timothy smiled then, the expression transforming his fever-bright features into something radiant with joy. "I was never gone, Papa. I was just waiting for you to forgive yourself enough to see me." The flames began to swirl again, and Timothy's form dissolved back into dancing light. But before the image faded completely, he reached out one last time, not in desperate need, but in blessing, in forgiveness, in the kind of love that transcends death itself, "The first trial is past," the Guardian leader announced, and Amos thought he detected a note of approval in that ancient voice. "You have faced your deepest fear and found truth within it. But courage alone is not enough to guard the sacred places. Next, you must demonstrate wisdom." As the sacred fire settled back into its steady blue-silver glow, Amos felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The weight of guilt that had pressed down on him for 20 years was still there, but it had transformed from a burden into something else, a reminder of how precious love could be, how carefully it needed to be tended, how much it was worth protecting. Little Bear caught his eye from across the grove, its small face glowing with pride and encouragement. The eagle feather in Amos's hand pulsed with warmth, a tangible reminder that he was not alone in this trial, that forces beyond his understanding were working to help him succeed. 2 more trials awaited him, each one designed to test a different aspect of his worthiness to become a guardian of the sacred places. But for the first time in 20 years, Amos faced the unknown with something approaching confidence. He had found his son again, not in the flames of memory, but in the eternal fire of love that connected all living things. And that fire would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The healing springs emerged from the earth as the second trial began, bubbling up through cracks in the stone floor of the grove, with water so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The springs hadn't been there moments before. Amos was certain of that, but now they flowed as if they had always been part of this sacred place, their gentle murmur adding a new voice to the ancient chorus of wind and flame. "The second trial is wisdom," the Guardian leader intoned, his massive form silhouetted against the dancing flames. "You must choose between the needs of one and the needs of many, knowing that both choices carry consequences that will echo through generations." As he spoke, the springs began to show images in their crystal-clear depths, visions that played out like scenes from some cosmic theater. Amos saw himself standing at a crossroads in time, faced with a choice that would determine the fate of everything he had come to love. In one vision, he saw himself taking Little Bear away from this sacred place, returning to the world of humans, where they could live quietly together as father and child. The image was achingly beautiful. Little Bear growing stronger and wiser under his care, the two of them finding peace in simple domesticity, building the kind of family relationship that had been stolen from him by Timothy's death. But as the vision continued, Amos saw the consequences of that choice rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Without Little Bear's presence to maintain the ancient connections, the sacred grove began to wither. The network of consciousness that linked every living thing in the mountain ecosystem started to fragment and fade. Trees sickened and died. Animals fled to distant territories. The springs of healing dried up, leaving only barren stone where life had once flourished. The second vision showed him making the opposite choice, allowing Little Bear to fulfill its destiny as a bridge between worlds, accepting the role of guardian, even though it meant watching his adopted child transform into something beyond human understanding. In this future, the sacred places remained strong and vital, their healing power spreading outward to touch countless lives. But the cost was personal and immediate. Little Bear would become something more than the child who had filled the empty spaces in his heart, and Amos would spend eternity as its protector rather than its father. "Choose," the Guardian leader commanded, and Amos felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him like the hand of God. He looked across the grove to where Little Bear stood among the other guardians, its small form dwarfed by their ancient majesty, but somehow not diminished by the comparison. In its eyes, he saw a wisdom that transcended its apparent youth, an understanding of what was being asked and a willingness to accept whatever choice he made. "What does Little Bear want?" Amos asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The creature stepped forward, moving with the ceremonial gravity that had marked its behavior since the trials began. It approached the healing springs and knelt beside them. placing its hands on the stone edge and closing its eyes in what appeared to be deep communion with the forces flowing beneath the earth. When it opened its eyes again, Little Bear looked directly at Amos and began the complex series of gestures that had become their shared language. But this time, the meaning was crystal clear, needing no interpretation or guesswork. Little Bear wanted to serve, to fulfill the purpose for which it had been born, to become the bridge between worlds that could heal not just individual creatures, but the very fabric of reality itself. More than that, it wanted Amos to understand that this wasn't a sacrifice, but a fulfillment. The completion of a journey that had begun when Timothy's spirit chose to transcend death rather than simply succumb to it. "You're asking me to let you go," Amos said, his voice thick with emotion. "To choose the needs of the world over my own need to be your father." Little Bear nodded, then did something that nearly broke his heart. It reached into the healing springs and cupped some of the glowing water in its small hands, offering it to him like a gift. As Amos accepted the water and felt its warmth spread through his body, he understood what Little Bear was trying to tell him. Love didn't diminish when it was shared. It multiplied. By allowing Little Bear to become what it was meant to be, he wasn't losing a child. He was gaining the chance to be a father to every living thing in this sacred place, to nurture and protect on a scale that transcended individual relationships. "I choose the world," Amos said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I choose to let you become what you need to become, even if it means I have to love you differently than I planned." The healing springs erupted in brilliant light, their waters cascading upward in defiance of gravity as the grove itself seemed to pulse with approval. Little Bear's form began to shimmer, its outline becoming less distinct as ancient power flowed through it like sunlight through crystal. "The second trial is past," the Guardian leader announced. "You have chosen wisdom over desire, service over self. But one trial remains, the test of sacrifice, which will determine whether your spirit is truly ready to bear the weight of guardianship." As the springs settled back into their gentle flow and Little Bear's transformation began in earnest, Amos felt the last of his old life falling away like a discarded coat. Whatever he had been before this moment was ending, and whatever he was becoming would be tested one final time before he could claim his place among the protectors of the sacred world. The new wooden carving took shape beneath Amos's knife as spring returned to the mountain, each careful cut revealing the form that had been waiting inside the pine block all along. It was Little Bear, as he remembered it best. Not the transformed guardian it had become, but the frightened, injured child he had found crying in the snow 3 months ago. The figure was small enough to fit in his palm, its features carved with the kind of loving detail that could only come from memory, burnished bright by affection. The final trial had tested his willingness to sacrifice everything: his human identity, his mortal limitations, his very sense of self, to become something larger and more enduring. The transformation had been both agonizing and ecstatic, like dying and being reborn in the same moment. When it was over, he was still Amos Wilder in all the ways that mattered. But he was also something more, a guardian whose consciousness could extend through every root and branch of the sacred forest, whose heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of seasons and storms. Little Bear visited him often in its new form, appearing sometimes as the child he had rescued, sometimes as a being of pure light that danced between the trees like animated starfire. The conversations they shared now took place without words, heart speaking directly to heart in the language that predated speech itself. But the love between them remained unchanged, if anything deeper than before, rooted in understanding that transcended the boundaries between mortal and eternal. The cabin had become something of a way station for creatures in need of healing. Bird traveled through the forest in ways that defied human comprehension, carried on currents of wind and water, passed from animal to animal until it reached those who needed help. They came to him with injuries and illnesses that ranged from the simple to the impossible, broken bones that mended under his touch, sicknesses that fled before the power that flowed through his hands, spirits that had lost their way back to their bodies and needed gentle guidance home. Each healing felt like a small miracle, but Amos had learned to accept the impossible as simply another facet of the world he now inhabited. The medicine pouch his grandfather had carried was no longer necessary. The knowledge it contained had become part of his being, along with wisdom that stretched back to the earliest days when humans and the forest spirits had worked in harmony. The letter had arrived on a warm day in late April, carried by a mountain man who traded in the valleys below and occasionally brought news from the outside world. It was from Amos's sister Martha, named for the wife he had, lost so long ago, written in the careful script of someone, unused to putting feelings into words. "We heard you might still be alive up in those mountains," the letter read. "I know we didn't part on good terms after Timothy's funeral, and I know you had your reasons for leaving. But I wanted you to know that there's always been a place for you here if you ever decide to come home. My grandson Billy is about the age Timothy would have been if things had been different. He asks about his Uncle Amos sometimes, wants to know if you're really as tough as the stories make you sound." Amos smiled as he read those words, remembering the arguments that had driven him from his family 20 years ago. They had wanted him to accept Timothy's death as God's will, to move on and rebuild his life, as if love could be transferred from one object to another like money changing hands. At the time, their practical kindness had felt like betrayal. Now he understood that they had been trying to help in the only way they knew how, offering the comfort of community and continuity in the face of loss that defied understanding. Their intentions had been good, even if their methods had driven him deeper into isolation. He sat down at the small table where he took his meals and began composing a reply, the words flowing with surprising ease. He told Martha about the peace he had found in the mountains, about the healing work that gave his life meaning, about the child who had found him and taught him that love could take forms he had never imagined. He didn't mention the supernatural aspects of his new existence. Some truths were too large for letters, but he wrote about forgiveness and second chances, about the way time could heal wounds that had seemed mortal. "Give Billy my love," he concluded, "and tell him that his Uncle Amos is exactly as tough as the stories say, but in ways that have nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with learning how to love without fear." As evening settled over the mountain and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Amos finished the wooden carving and placed it on the mantel beside Timothy's horse. The two figures seemed to watch over the cabin together, one representing the son he had lost, the other the child he had found and learned to love with a father's heart. Little Bear materialized beside the fireplace, as it often did at this quiet hour, its form shifting between the familiar child shape and something more ethereal, more connected to the flow of life that pulsed through every living thing. They sat together in comfortable silence, guardian and bridgekeeper, father and child in ways that transcended biology or law. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of creatures going about their nightly business, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves singing to the moon. But underneath those familiar sounds, Amos could hear something else now, something that had always been there but which his human ears had been too limited to perceive. It was the voice of the mountain itself, the deep song that connected every stone and stream and growing thing in a harmony that stretched back to the beginning of time. He was part of that song now, his own voice woven into the eternal chorus that would continue long after individual trees fell and rivers changed their courses and seasons turned in their ancient dance. The wooden carving gleamed in the firelight, a bridge between past and present, between love lost and love found, between the man he had been and the guardian he had become. And in its simple perfection, Amos Wilder found the peace that had eluded him for 20 years, not the end of grief, but its transformation into something larger and more enduring than sorrow. The mountains sang around him, and he sang back, his voice joining the eternal conversation between all living things. A harmony of healing that would continue as long as there were hearts brave enough to love without condition, and wise enough to let that love change them.